In the early morning hours over Tripoli, an A330 is on final approach. The morning fog has set in over the airport, making it hard to see the threshold. The pilots scan the darkness, searching for the airfield's lights. But with no visual contact with the runway and altitude warnings indicating that the ground is just beneath them, the flight crew makes a split-second decision: abort the landing and initiate a go-around. The engines roar at full power and the aircraft begins its climb away from the ground. But disoriented by the lack of visual references and struggling to interpret what the instruments are telling them, the pilots make a series of critical errors. Their inputs send the aircraft into a steep dive. Airspeed climbs dangerously close to the aircraft's limit, and the onboard terrain warning system is screaming at the flight crew. What was meant to be a routine landing is turning into a disaster. Will the pilots be able to regain control? This is the story of Afreya Airways Flight 771. On May 11, 2010, a one-year-old Airbus A330 operated by Libya's national airline, Africa Airways, was preparing to depart O.R. Tambo International Airport in Johannesburg as Flight 771. Having arrived from Tripoli just before sunrise earlier in the day, the flight crew returned to the aircraft after a 15-hour rest in Johannesburg, now getting the aircraft ready for the return journey. The Airbus was carrying 93 passengers, 8 cabin crew members, and 3 pilots. With 230 passenger seats, the aircraft was loaded to less than half of its capacity. At 9:30 p.m. local time, once all passengers were on the plane and settled in for their trip, the aircraft was pushed back from the gate, and the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for departure. The pilot in command for Flight 771 was 57-year-old Captain Isef Al-Sudi. He had accumulated a total of 17,000 flight hours. He had been a captain since 1988 and had flown a range of commercial aircraft before joining Africa Airways in 2007 as an A320 captain. He later upgraded to the wide-body A330. In the right seat was 42-year-old Tark Abu Al-Shawashi with a total of 4,200 hours of flight time. He had previously flown the Twin Otter, a small turboprop, as well as the Airbus A320. He was the pilot flying on this return leg, which meant that he was at the controls, while the captain, serving as the pilot monitoring, was in charge of radio communications and maintaining a general watch of the aircraft. In addition to the minimum required crew of one captain and his co-pilot, the crew of Flight 771 was augmented by the inclusion of a relief pilot, 37-year-old Nazim Alahuni, who had logged nearly 1,900 hours of flight time. The relief pilot's role on Flight 771 was to sit in and replace either the captain or the first officer during the cruise portion of the flight so that they could leave the flight deck and rest for a few hours. Although they had had over 15 hours of rest between the flights, operating 2 night flights in a row could affect the flight crew's ability to remain alert throughout the flight. Adding to the overall fatigue is the fact that the flight was scheduled to arrive at 4 a.m., which falls within the window of circadian low, a period of day which is scientifically proven to be associated with the lowest energy levels in humans. All things considered, this concept of an augmented crew is a helpful method in managing long-haul flying at odd times of day. At 9:45 p.m. local time, after a 15-minute taxi for departure, Flight 771 lifted off from Johannesburg, carrying 104 people and 51,000 kilograms of fuel, and turned northbound for the 7-hour journey to Tripoli. Flight 771 was about to cross the entire African continent northbound, approaching the North African coast just before dawn. As they leveled off at their cruise altitude, both the captain and the first officer took turns in delegating their duties to the relief pilot and leaving the flight deck so that they could take a few hours of rest before coming back for the arrival. Approximately 2 hours before arrival, the captain returned to the flight deck from his scheduled rest, and the flight crew began their preparations for the approach and landing. The pilots received the latest weather report from the destination. Most recent weather observations indicated that the sky was clear and the winds were calm. Although not yet reported in any of the reports by the airport's weather reporting facilities, a layer of mist and fog had begun forming over the runway due to the increase in moisture in the air. This phenomenon, known as advection fog, is common in coastal regions. As the air begins to warm up with the rising sun, the fog dissipates. Therefore, its presence is typically short-lived and does not cause problems. This time, however, things turned out to be different. 30 minutes prior to arrival, after talking to ATC, the crew was instructed to plan on flying the locator approach to runway 09, and the aircraft was cleared to fly directly to the initial approach waypoint. A locator approach is a non-precision approach that provides only lateral guidance to the runway, unlike an ILS approach, which offers both lateral and vertical guidance. At Tripoli Airport, it relies on a ground-based VOR/DME beacon located near the airport, which transmits a radio signal in all directions. Using the aircraft's navigation radios, pilots tune into the signal and set the final approach course on their navigation equipment. If the aircraft drifts off course, this deviation is shown on the navigation display, allowing the pilot or autopilot to stay aligned with the runway centerline. In addition to lateral guidance, the DME portion of the beacon provides the aircraft's distance from the transmitter. From this, the distance to the runway threshold can also be calculated. This is a key value pilots use to determine the correct point to begin the descent. Because the VOR/DME beacon provides no vertical guidance, the descent must be managed manually by the crew. Pilots can either use a step-down approach, descending to designated altitudes at each waypoint, or descend continuously by following a standard 3 degrees descent angle, which is commonly used worldwide. How the lateral signal is used on board the aircraft depends on the selected flight mode. There are two types of guidance used on the A330 aircraft: selected and managed. In selected mode, the pilot sets both the aircraft's heading and descent rate manually using the dial knobs on the Flight Control Unit, or FCU. In managed mode, these parameters are controlled automatically by the aircraft's flight management computer. To use managed mode, the non-precision approach must be included in the onboard navigation database. In that case, the aircraft's flight management guidance and envelope computer uses the final approach course to the runway as the desired track and calculates a descent rate based on the aircraft's speed and distance from the runway. The Airbus fleet at Africa Airways was provided with the appropriate navigation databases that allowed for the use of the managed mode during approaches. Therefore, it was the preferred method of flying non-precision approaches at this company. Regardless of which guidance mode is used, standard Airbus procedures call for the flight path vector, often nicknamed the bird, to be displayed on the primary flight display. The FPV shows the aircraft's projected path based on its current speed and attitude and helps pilots visually align their flight path with the runway. While it's just a visual aid, it's a familiar tool during non-precision approaches, especially in selected mode where pilots manually guide the aircraft using cues like the FPV rather than relying fully on automation. The typical procedure for flying the locator approach for runway 09 at Tripoli International Airport is to maintain an altitude of at least 2,000 feet above sea level before intercepting the final approach course approximately 10 miles from the runway threshold. Once within the 10 miles mark, aircraft step down further to 1,350 feet and intercept waypoint Tango Whiskey, located 3.9 miles from the runway threshold and 5.2 miles from the Tripoli VOR beacon. Passing this waypoint marks the beginning of the final approach phase, at which point aircraft descend to the minimum descent altitude of 620 feet above sea level. At this point, the crew must decide whether to continue the approach and land if the runway is in sight or abort the landing and initiate a missed approach if they cannot see the runway. Despite the variety of options available for the approach to Tripoli Airport, the flight crew of Africa Airways Flight 771 did not discuss which guidance mode they would be using for this arrival. The approach briefing carried out by the first officer was very short and did not include all of the items required by the company's standard operating procedures. Although not ideal and not conforming to company procedures, such practice is quite common in situations where the crew does not anticipate challenges and where an approach is conducted in a familiar environment. Landing at the home base of Tripoli on a seemingly good weather day was one of these cases. Unfortunately, complacency can have consequences. Approximately 10 miles back from the airport, the crew finished the approach checklist and descended to 1,800 feet consistent with company requirements. The crew pushed the Track FPA Heading VS button to switch to Track FPA mode. This action also enabled the FPV symbol on the primary flight display. Once the aircraft began lining up with the final approach course for runway 09, the first officer asked the captain to extend the wing flaps to configuration 1. The captain suggested to the first officer that they should use the NAV approach, even though this had not been included in the approach briefing and was not communicated using standard terminology. He implied flying the approach in managed mode, allowing the aircraft to follow the programmed lateral and vertical path using the navigation database. As discussed earlier, Africa Airways procedures require the use of the managed mode for non-precision approaches, and the first officer verbally agreed with this plan. Shortly thereafter, the captain made a track FPA call, likely intended as a check to ensure that the flight path vector, or the bird, was displayed on the primary flight display. However, as the captain had only previously flown such approaches in selected mode and did not use standard Airbus terminology to clearly confirm the intended guidance, the first officer misunderstood the call as a signal to prepare for a descent in selected mode. In many flight decks, especially when flying in selected mode, pilots rely heavily on the FPV to guide their descent manually. So, hearing track FPA without additional clarification reinforced the first officer's belief that the captain wanted to switch to selected mode for the descent. Because it was still too early to begin the final descent for the runway, he responded by saying that he would push the button a few minutes later after they passed the final approach fix approximately 4 miles from the runway. No further discussion followed, and from this point on, a critical situation began to develop inside the flight deck as the pilots were no longer on the same page about which guidance mode to use. A minute later, the flight crew extended the flaps to the configuration 2 position and descended to 1,400 feet. The captain said, "Give it to the approach now," in Arabic, which the first officer understood as an instruction to activate the approach mode. The first officer complied, pushing the approach button on the FCU. By activating the approach mode, he switched the aircraft to managed guidance mode, setting it up to automatically follow the programmed approach path toward the runway. Despite thinking that the captain wanted to fly the approach in the selected mode, the first officer did not question the instruction. At this stage, both pilots appeared to be aligned in their approach strategy. Shortly thereafter, the flight crew finished configuring the aircraft for landing by moving the flaps to the full position and extending the landing gear. As he saw the distance of 5.2 miles displayed on the aircraft's navigation system, and thinking that he was over the Tango Whiskey waypoint located 5.2 miles from the VOR/DME beacon, the first officer began the descent for the runway by manually selecting a descent angle of -3 degrees. He did so based on the earlier track FPA call from the captain, which he had misunderstood as a shift toward selected mode. Even though the aircraft was flying in managed mode at that time and no change in strategy had been discussed, the 5.2 miles he saw represented the distance to the runway threshold, which was 1.3 miles closer to the aircraft. As a result, the aircraft began descending before reaching the actual Tango Whiskey waypoint, a crucial error. The first officer verbally announced to the captain that he had changed the aircraft's guidance mode, but the captain did not hear him. He was busy talking to the crew of another Africa Airways flight that had just landed. The crew of the other Africa Airways flight had contacted Flight 771 and, addressing the captain personally, informed him that they had encountered some low-lying clouds right over the runway. In just a matter of minutes, the crew made several mistakes, none of which they had realized at the time. First, the captain believed the aircraft was still descending in managed mode, unaware that the first officer had manually selected a descent angle, switching the aircraft's vertical guidance to selected mode. Second, the descent was initiated too early, nearly a mile before reaching the Tango Whiskey waypoint. This happened because the first officer misread the navigation display. Both misunderstandings, one about the guidance mode, the other about descent timing, would prove critical for the remainder of the flight. Continuing the descent for the runway, a computerized voice inside the flight deck sounded a 100 above call, alerting the crew that they were 100 feet above the minimum descent altitude. In only a few more seconds, the A330 would be at the decision altitude, but due to starting the descent too early, it was 2 miles further back from the runway than it should have been. Despite not seeing the runway through the low-lying clouds, the captain instructed the first officer to continue the approach. Continue! Having assumed that the captain saw the runway, the first officer complied and continued the descent. A few seconds later, still not having the runway in sight, the first officer asked the captain whether they should conduct a missed approach procedure and try again. The captain did not respond. As the aircraft reached the altitude of 300 feet above the ground, the first officer asked the captain one more time. Once again, no response followed. Suddenly, at only 280 feet above the ground, the aircraft's terrain awareness system sounded a computerized, too low terrain warning. The plane descended too low and was on a collision course with the ground. Surprised and not seeing the runway ahead, the captain yelled to the first officer to go around. Go around! Go around! Go around! Initiating the missed approach procedure, the first officer moved the thrust levers to full power, disconnected the autopilot, and began to pitch the aircraft's nose up. Having barely escaped a high-speed impact with the ground, the aircraft began climbing away for another attempt. With no visual references due to the low-lying clouds and no visible horizon since the sun had not risen yet, the flight crew was flying in the dark. Quickly moving the aircraft's nose up as part of the go-around procedure, while also increasing engine power, had significantly affected the pilot's vestibular organs. The sudden increase in engine power in particular had created a feeling that the aircraft continued to pitch up even though the angle of climb did not change. Trusting their inner ear senses that went against what they were seeing on the flight instruments, the crew of Flight 771 fell victim to the somatographic illusion. To recover from the perceived high-pitch condition and avoid losing too much airspeed, the first officer pushed the side stick all the way forward. After climbing away for only 4 seconds, the aircraft pitched down and began to fly toward the ground again. With the nose pointing downward, the A330 approached the maximum allowable speed for the flap's full configuration. Exceeding this speed can damage the flap mechanism and make it inoperable. Seeing the rise in the airspeed, the crew moved the flap's 1 position up to the flap's 3 configuration. Still thinking that they were climbing too fast, the captain grabbed his side stick and also pushed it all the way forward to lower the aircraft's nose. Adding to the overall chaos and confusion, the TAWS began issuing terrain warnings again. Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up. Hearing the instruction to pull up, the first officer began pitching up to recover. Yet the aircraft did not respond. The captain, while still pushing the side stick all the way forward, had pressed the side stick priority button, a button specific to the Airbus side stick flight control system. As the name implies, side sticks are located to the side of each pilot and are moved independently of each other. During the flight, the onboard aircraft computer receives input from both side sticks and sends the average signal from both inputs to the flight controls. Hence, if pilots are adding exact opposite inputs, the resulting signal to the flight controls is neutral, a condition called dual input. To avoid dual input situations, Airbus has added a priority button for each pilot, which when held down cancels out any input from the other pilot. Although a caution message will pop up showing which side has control priority, standard Airbus procedures also require the pilot pushing the priority button to inform the other pilot that they have control of the aircraft. On Flight 771, however, no communication was made by the captain as he continued holding the side stick priority button and pushing the side stick forward. In the overall haste of the situation, he simply didn't realize that he was pressing the button. Despite the first officer's best attempts to recover the aircraft, his inputs were no longer affecting it, something neither pilot realized. At only 180 feet above the ground, the captain finally released the side stick priority button and began pitching up. Although both pilots were now trying their best to reduce the aggressive nose-down attitude, there was simply not enough altitude for a successful recovery. The aircraft impacted the ground at a ground speed of 260 knots, only 1.2 kilometers from the threshold of runway 09. The force of the impact broke the aircraft apart into pieces that were spread out over an area nearly 1 kilometer long and 90 m wide. The tail section was the only part of the aircraft that remained relatively intact. Against all odds, when first responders arrived at the scene, they recovered one sole survivor of the accident, a 9-year-old boy who was traveling with his parents. Tragically, all other passengers on board lost their lives. Although the boy sustained severe injuries, including crushed legs, and underwent multiple surgeries, he fully recovered after some time in the hospital. The story of Africa Flight 771 is a vivid example of how small mishaps can line up and lead to a big disaster, a concept illustrated by the Swiss cheese model. Reviewing the accident flight data, the investigators identified multiple breakdowns throughout the flight that allowed this to happen. The Libyan Civil Aviation Authority has determined that a lack of proper crew resource management was a significant contributor to this accident. It was evident that the flight crew were not on the same page regarding the state of the aircraft and what approach mode to use. Completing the approach in the managed guidance mode would have allowed the aircraft to maintain a stabilized approach path and arrive at the minimum descent altitude at a more appropriate distance from the threshold. Despite being present in the cockpit as an observer and thus being a third set of eyes, no recording showed that the relief pilot made comments or intervened throughout the approach.